never enough for me to consider as a person who would consider myself as a person who would get into an art kind of job or career. So I originally wanted to get into medicine. I was very driven. I studied very hard in school, got all the right grades, and somehow got rejected from every place that I applied to. And I ended up applying out of a fear of not being productive. And that's kind of a very heavy statement these days. But out of a fear of not being productive, I applied to the American University in Dubai. I kind of didn't want to spend a year at home waiting. So I got into visual communication. And then, secretly my parents were saying, "Oh, we told you so. We told you you'd be an artist." So I got into graphic design, and I spent 3 really wonderful years there. Finished my program really quickly, and upon graduating, I realized that I had all these skills that I was very excited to use, but the reality of using them as a graphic designer were not appealing to me, and I found myself filled with doubt and also disbelief. So I had these skills and I worked on these projects, but I don't think that this is how I want to use them, and I didn't really know how to articulate that. And so I had a friend who had gone to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and had just come back and told me about something along the lines of like, you don't even know the things that you don't know yet or what you could do. And that kind of got me excited. So I applied, didn't think too much of it, and I got in with a partial scholarship. That kind of really motivated me. And so my parents were so generous and decided to continue supporting me. And I went. So in my first week, I had no clue what I was doing. I had all these 5 courses that were randomly selected because I had gotten into the program pretty late. And I went to change one of them, and I ended up changing all of them. And I coincidentally took this comic book class. It was in that class that I kind of realized what I could be doing. I felt like I spent a lot of my time in graphic design making work that looks professional by a standard that was kind of set in other places. What does a good campaign look like? What does a good poster look like? What does a good brand look like? And then in comics, I had to suddenly tell stories, and being so far away from home, all I could think about was Fairuz music. And I had never been one to listen to Fairuz music, but here was this opportunity where I had all these things that I wanted to put back out into the world that suddenly seemed very devoid of these things. And so this is an image of the first comic I made. So it was multiple pages. I remade it recently, so this is the remade version, but it was kind of a story based off of lyrics written by the Rahbani brothers for Fairuz to sing. And I think it was there that I realized that we could be addressing, or I could be addressing a lack in my work rather than wanting to be like something else. So it was really great. I felt like I had found this new way of making that was now in hindsight very relevant to what I was interested in: comics, cartooning, animation, and yet I couldn't see it until I got into the class. And I spent the rest of my time at the School of the Art Institute taking a combination of drawing courses and animation courses and comic courses. Upon my return to the UAE, it was very difficult, honestly. Like, I had these skills that I was excited to use and kind of knew how to use them now, but no financial opportunities for me to use them, or very, very few. And I was still very lucky. So Sitka was happening at the time, and I was able to apply for, I submitted a proposal and got funding for it. And I also realized that the one thing I really loved about comics was being able to share stories. And especially when these were stories that we weren't used to hearing, I thought sharing them was so much more important. And so the first time I participated in Sitka, I wrote this story about sharing recipes, particularly Palestinian recipes, which was really important to me when I was far away from home. Recipes that my mom or my aunts would share with us, kind of in a narrative format that elaborated on the process of sharing recipes and what meaning they could hold. So I made an Arabic version and an English version, and I don't usually write in Arabic, and it was really difficult to get it translated just the right way. And I did it, and I was so excited, and I put it out there, and I actually have no more copies left. People took them all. But I also realized that there were some people who couldn't access the comic because they couldn't read Arabic or English. And out of, even though the experience was very positive, this is the only thing I could remember, and it was weighing very heavily on me. So for the next year, when I applied with another proposal for a project, I decided to go and make a silent comic and see how long I can push a narrative without any language restrictions. And I realized so more people took those comics. I printed more, and I was really happy to see that somehow this was more inclusive in a way that was meaningful to me. So I didn't have to rely on people not having or having to read English or Arabic to understand what I was saying. It's a tricky territory, though, right? So Arabic is a huge part of being Palestinian and sharing Palestinian recipes. So I think this is the first time I had to kind of come to terms with what can you say without a language, or what elements do I need to remove or negotiate in order to embrace a larger group of people. Shortly after, kind of, and there were a few jobs here and there, very few and far in between, related to illustration, which was kind of the only way I was making money at the time, and teaching a few workshops in animation. But I was lucky enough to get nominated to the fellowship program, the Sheikh Salam Emerging Artist Fellowship, by a professor at the American University in Dubai, who was my mentor when I was a student there, and I had begun working as a TA for her. So I really enjoyed working with her. I really enjoyed being back in the university, and then I got this amazing fellowship, and I felt like for the first time I had a community of not just friends, but peers, people who were professionally invested as a group in this industry, though still in its infancy. And I still am very grateful. These are people who I don't just go to because they're my friends to talk about my life. They're people I go to talk about my professional pursuits and the struggles and their struggles. And together, I think that was a wonderful year for me in my practice. I was able to develop a lot of work and use my skills, illustration and otherwise, to do things that I hadn't thought of doing before. So here are some images of two particular projects that were happening at that time. One of them, which was another really important project to me, Tabsit al-Istishraq, or Simplifying Orientalism. This was an illustrated children's activity book done in the style of a numbers education book that you would find in the UAE. But it was during that time that I kind of became very sensitive to how I've been very very in love, or like amused, entertained, captivated by Orientalist imagery, because it's like shoved down your throat everywhere you go. And at the same time, realizing that I was repulsed by it. And so this book was kind of this figuring out what it means to look or perpetuate these Orientalist images. And so you'll see here that it's a book where you would need to repeat a number. So like the number 3, you'd write it over and over and over again. But the images that were used to illustrate the number were taken from Western-made references about the Arab world, and they would kind of be associated with a Middle Eastern stereotype. So in the example here, it says three wise men. And the numbers would go on to 10, and then start taking ridiculous leaps. So after 10, it was 40 thieves, 72 virgins, 1,001 knights. And every single time there would be an accompanying illustrations that count every single number. So when you get to 1,001 knights, it's just pages and pages of moons. The other one was this other experiment in repetition. And so figuring out value, content, and ritual. So the kiswa of the Kaaba is hand embroidered. It takes a full year to complete a new one and is replaced. And when I think about where does the value come from? Why is gold and silver used as an embroidery material? Does that add value, or is it the ritual, or is it the fact that this is made by hand? And figuring out what it is that gives value to an object became of interest to me. And so these were these pixelated repetitions of this object that's very important culturally. Not that that yield any conclusions for me, but it's one of those things that I had to do to understand more about. I was luckier after that because of the support of the Sheikh Salama Foundation and my peers. I was able to apply to grad school, and I was also really lucky. I got into almost every program I applied to, and I started having to make really difficult decisions about where I was going to go. But it was because of the Orientalism Project and working as a TA in Dubai, and having been a student in Dubai, that I realized I didn't want to be part of a problem. I thought it was a problem. All the instructors I had flew in for the job, had very little understanding of what I had grown up with or what was important to me or what was important in my community. And all they could do was show me things from their communities, which is great, but that's most of what I was exposed to. And that professor I was working for, she was like the only Arab professor I had at the time. And I realized that there were so many things I could do as part of my projects in her class that I didn't have to worry about explaining, because fundamentally as Arabs, we understood something, whether it was linguistically, culturally, geographically. And it wasn't through this lens where it's like fascinating because it's, I don't know, gilded or mysterious. And so this at the forefront of my thinking made the program that I applied to the most interesting. So VCU School of the Arts in Richmond, Virginia, offers a teaching assistantship in the graduate program for painting and printmaking. And I knew that I was definitely interested in print. And so it was kind of at that point when I realized that was what my priority was, it was a no-brainer. I knew that this is where I wanted to be. And so I went, and that brought in a whole bunch of other problems that I couldn't have even anticipated. It was a great experience. I learned a lot. But I also realized that a lot of the things that I was interested in talking about were very foreign to the people I was talking to about them. This is one of the first projects I did while I was there. I was very interested in a lot of Islamic imagery, not in the sense of like repeating geometric patterns, but like, what is Islamic imagery? How do we define it? What makes it? Why does it bear a weight? Even though it's a visual and not necessarily a lifestyle or a meaning. So I kind of, I went through a lot of these projects when really silent crits that terrified me. And then out of frustration, this project was born, where I was like, how do you explain, at that point I was like 25, and I was like, how do you explain 25 years of growing up in a country that's predominantly Muslim, having gone to school, taken Islamic classes, and even if you don't practice, you still are very aware of all the intricacies, culturally speaking. And I kind of at that point was like, Google it, like just Google everything you don't know. And so I created this Quran that was literally Google image search, because images are read faster than words, of every single surah title, and then going to, like, if I couldn't explain what the surah's name meant, I would like look up how to translate it and how to explain it. And I designed it in a way that it kind of reflected the hierarchy of information that you would find in a Quran. And I would, in the crit where I displayed this was kind of just available for people to flip through before they entered the room, so they can kind of have this information as they enter a space where I was making other work. And then I think I got it out of my system, and I was just like confused, but I kind of realized I needed to do something else. I didn't want people to think of my work as novel or foreign. That was not at all what I was interested in. And that kind of began this, and then, there was like a period of like struggle, and then, Trump got elected and the Muslim ban came into play. And that was, I never thought of myself as someone who could be so easily stimulated by political activity. And it affected me. It really did. I mean, I consider myself to be very fortunate and very lucky that I can travel, and I was receiving support for school, but flying into the States was unbelievably difficult, and in many cases very humiliating. And so at the same time, I was inviting people over to my studio, having these really wonderful studio visits with very generous, caring people, my peers, visiting artists. And we'd talk about my work, and then they would ask me about where I was from, and then I'd start talking about Dubai, and then I'd talk about Palestine, and talk about how I've never been to Palestine, and how I use this one particular soap. And I had like this stack of Nabulsi soap in my studio that I had brought from Dubai, and I would give them one until I ran out, and then I wanted to buy some more from the States. It was so expensive, um, and then one of my peers in the graduate program told me that I was so much more excited about giving away that soap that was really expensive than I was about when I was talking about my work. And it came with a lot of information and a lot of sensual or like to do with the senses stimulus that kind of wasn't present in a lot of the things that I was doing at the time. And something clicked. And I'm still very grateful for that comment. And I was like, if this is what I'm interested in, if this is what I'm excited about, this is what I should be devoting my time to. So I disappeared for 2 months. I was just teaching myself how to make soap. And the first batch of soap that I had shared with my peers was a series of 7 soaps that I had made with culinary spice blends from each of the countries from the Middle East that were banned in the US. So people who would take the soap and use it would smell like the foreigners that are now no longer allowed in their country. And that was so that was like a big turning point in my practice. I was relying heavily on my skills in digital media and printmaking up until that point. And afterwards I was like, anything that I work in multiples and can share is of interest to me. So I kind of wanted to get out of that. The image you see here is of an iteration of the soap project that I did it for my candidacy show at the end of my first year in grad school. I had created a stack of soaps with charcoal. They're kind of this large, dense black thing that if you choose to take and use, it's actually very beneficial for you, but not necessarily at a first glance. There was a live feed to my apartment where I was making soap, and me being a non-white skinned person in a mask with what looks like a chemistry lab using lye, which is a very dangerous material but necessary to make soap, and you could order as much of it as you want online from Amazon and no one will ask questions. And yet for you to get a piece of luggage through customs with an orange is unbelievably suspicious there. So this was a tension that kind of made no sense to me, and so I kind of wanted to understand that tension a little bit more. So kind of feeding people this information. This is the reality of the situation. I'm making soap in my apartment every single day at this time, and this is the result of that labor, and you're free to take it. Most of the soap went away. People were very happy to take it, and I would find bits of my soap later scattered throughout campus, which was very nice, I have to say. The project developed from there. It wasn't just about soap. I realized a lot of things about sharing that meant a lot to me. I think as Arabs, or as an Arab, and many of you who are Arab or have lived in an Arab country are probably familiar with, if someone tells you that, oh, I really like that lamp, your shirt, whatever, and you're like, "Muqaddama, here, have it." And it's this thing that's so common and yet so difficult to explain to cultures that don't understand it, but so important to how I live. And so I think this was the beginning of an investigation into hospitality. So the work you see here was during my thesis exhibition. It wasn't just soap. It was three trays that were engraved with a map. The map was a reconstruction of the map made by Al-Idrisi, an Arab map maker in the Islamic Golden Age, who was commissioned by King Roger of Sicily to create the world's most accurate map. And so Al-Idrisi moves to Sicily and conducts with his team a series of interviews with all the merchants and traders that were coming through. At the time, Sicily was very much like Dubai is today, a transportation hub. It was like kind of the center of the world, with presence from all over the world. So there were lots of Arabs, lots of Greeks, lots of Christians, Muslims. And it was kind of this really interesting point in history. And so the map was made, and it's this result of the interactions of many different people. It was compiled into a book called Nuzhatul Mushtaq fi Ikhtiraq al-Afaq. And the name that roughly translates to the pleasant journey of the one who is longing to traverse the horizons. The word mushtaq, which is the person who is longing, it's an interesting word. When I answered the phone and spoke to my loved ones when I was in the States and they asked me, how are you? I would say mushtaq. I miss, or I miss you. I miss everything. Um, and it's the root of the word is shauq, which is love characterized by absence. But in this context, in this map, it was used in a way to miss something that you've never had, the one who longs to permeate the horizons, to see places you haven't seen. And then it was at that moment I realized that I had gone to the States because I was missing, and I'm in the States and still missing, but they're just remarkably different and the same all at once. And so the map was also carved onto this large silver disc. After King Roger passed away, shortly after the creation of the disc, there was a revolt and the Muslims left Sicily. There was a lot of outrage at the tolerance of Sicily. And so El Idrisi was able to flee with his notes, and the map was lost to Europe for 300 years, during which the US was discovered because they did not have accurate maps. Prior to that, the secret of soap making was transported from Jerusalem to the south of France and Spain, and begins a very fruitful soap making industry. 500 years later in the US, people are trying to make soap, but it's really difficult to compete with an industry that is hundreds of years old and based in Europe. And so Procter & Gamble, a candle making company, sponsors and finances the experiments of an Austrian chemist to develop a process in which he could harden fats and make them transportable. And thus Crisco is invented. And so my soap was the closest, in my soap project, I was trying to closely replicate Palestinian soap using the resources at hand, and that meant Crisco. And I was very interested to find out that Crisco was already part of the soap making process. And so besides that, I was also sharing food recipes and offering someone to be part of my domain. You'll notice here that there are some texts. So I offered orange blossom water, soap, and spices and bread that I had baked myself. And so if looking at these texts, they're kind of like ways of quantifying things. So when you walked into the space, I took up the foyer. So you walk in and there was this big sign over the work that said there is enough for everyone. And people could take as much as they wanted to. And in that were various definitions of enough or quantity. So how long it takes for an orange tree to grow and produce enough flowers to create orange blossom water. Various definitions of what makes one part of someone else's domain. So we are kin when we eat the same bread and salt, have 4 servings of coffee together, or spend 3 days and nights with each other. And these are all part of various Arab subcultures. Upon my completion of my thesis, I applied for, or before completion, I applied for a fellowship at VCU in Qatar. And I was very excited. And at the same time, the blockade had just begun earlier that year. And so I still decided to go. And when I got there, I was very, well, it was a great time. I really loved being there. And it offered me something that I hadn't known, or I maybe desperately needed, which was affirmation regarding teaching. So while I was teaching in Richmond, it was very difficult to be able to relate to the students, similarly to how professors here were flown in for the job. It was very difficult for them to know what life was like for someone who lives here. And I felt I was that person in the States. But then when I went to Qatar, I was able to communicate with the students at a whole nother level that was really great. And I was very eager and very happy to engage with them. And so I taught a few courses, or 2 courses there. And I was very fortunate that I had such a wonderful community. The other artist in residence was a very, very good friend, and we would end up talking about everything and developing our work together. And I had this community that I was so surprised to find, and very grateful to have once again. And so this image that you see here is the result of the work I was doing while I was there. So I was trying to not let these vegetables go bad. Suddenly I was very aware of how it could all go away so quickly. So I started pickling them. And then I started trying to eat the pickles, which was very difficult. It's a lot. and so pickling became other processes of preservation. And so at the end of my time there, I was lucky to get an exhibition with Esma, the other artist in residence, and very good friend. Um, I displayed all these pickles that I had been producing throughout the year, and jams and makdoos, which I had also learned how to make because I really like makdoos. And then at the same time, I was also experiencing a lot of nationalist language. I'm not speaking specifically about Qatar, but everywhere in the world. And thinking about exclusivity and who that leaves out and who that it keeps included, I became very anxious and I wanted to examine that language a little bit more. Whether it's on a banner or in a postcard, similarly to thinking about language earlier in that comic. And so in addition to the pickles that were available for people to try, there were also these large banners that kind of elaborate or referred to nationalist language, however, had no images of a city or a location. And I was thinking of a city as something that is, or the nation as something far larger and more inclusive than something that is geographically specific or appearance specific. My first attempt was to create a postcard that had, instead of a skyline, a vegetable line, which sounds absurd now that I say it, but at the time it made a lot of sense to me. As well as documentation of that vegetable section that I first saw when I went to the supermarket. So what started off as a small box with cucumbers and eggplants, by the time I had left Qatar, was an entire section in the supermarket full of every vegetable you could think of. And so my pickle selection grew. And I was also kind of really happy to share the recipes and really happy to do the research. And I think doing research or putting myself in the situations where the research I do is something that I do want to add to my life rather than something that helps me get to a goal, but something that I can use in order to figure out what the goal is. And I was really sad to leave, but I felt like that project kind of helped me um, realize a lot of things that I was doing while I was making the soap, but because the format had changed, it opened me up to so many other um, it opened me up to so many things that were already happening in my own work that now I could identify. Because when you're in it and you're doing it for the first time, it's very difficult to be able to pinpoint all these things. Um, and then when it goes back to when I come back to the UAE and I'm currently working, because it's all as wonderful as it is to be an artist, it's very difficult to find support. And I was lucky for so long. That I did need to get a job, and so it's very difficult to balance a studio life with a 9 to 5 job. And while a job can be fulfilling in many ways, it also, like, working in the studio is fulfilling in other ways, and nothing can truly replace that. So I look for every opportunity I can to make. And so whether it's someone's birthday or sharing a gift with your students or your friends, I always find a reason to make something. I still make a lot of soap. I actually make soap every week with my mother, who now makes much better soap than I do. And I make these paper puppets from my animation days, and I make zines that I can print with the risograph machine I now have access to. Um, I know they're nowhere like a fully resolved project that kind of takes months and years to develop, but they still kind of allow me to share something, the skills that I've developed, particular engagement. So when I make these things, they're not shared with everyone, they're shared with a particular group, and therefore I need to make them with that group in mind. And it still allows me to exercise that kind of thinking and making that both project, the pickle project and the soap project, allowed me to develop. Um, and I recently got back into making comics. I haven't made a comic in so long, but I was very fortunate that I was finally, for the first time ever, commissioned to make a comic. That was like I never thought I'd live to see the day. But here I am making comics. And this was a recent one. You can find this one in the Sharjah Art Foundation in a really awesome publication with some really amazing people. It's called Corniche. I had a lot of fun making it. And with that, that's it so far. That's the journey up until now. I guess I could take questions if there are any.
Yeah, there's a few. I just want to say thank you again for being
Thank you so much.
this, despite all the the technical difficulties. So there's about 5 questions. We can see how many we can get through. If you want to stop sharing your screen and maybe
Sure.
my video again. Yeah. Yeah, you're back. Um, so one question we have from Khulud is, what influences or informs your visual language?
All right. So it was very difficult for me to, as someone who studied illustration and comics and graphic design, for me to abandon the visual. I'm not saying it as if to say that the visual is a bad thing, but I felt like there was a time, especially when I started making soap, where I was so concerned with the visual property that it distracted me from what the thing was actually meant to be. And I realized that if I focus more on what it's meant to be and what it's meant to evoke and what it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to be put out in the world, the visual will inform itself. And I have to make peace with the thing being what it's supposed to be. Sounds a little vague. I'm trying to make it more articulate, but like when working in with the pickles, for example, I was looking at packaging of produce. That's what informed the entire visual because that's what kind of marks produce. The visual language used to describe a local cucumber and a foreign cucumber was very different. And so that became a way like I want people to know that the cucumber was local. And so I had to use the language necessary to communicate that. When making soap, when you don't mix anything to soap, it's white. And so it has to be white. There's nothing I'm going to do to change that. Those soaps that were kind of embedded with spices, they turned out to be the colors that they were. And at first I was like, no, but they don't look like bricks. And then I realized they don't have to look like bricks. They just have to look like the soap that they are. That's one way in which I work. The other way is when making zines and illustrations, I think about time. And time is a huge factor to how much labor can go into something. And so I use that to gauge how much labor I can do, whether I want to learn a new visual style in order to communicate something or use skills that I already have. It's very difficult to communicate that to clients, though, on the most part. So I try not to get too wordy with it.
Okay.
I hope that answered the question.
Um, we also have one from Aisha. But if you can unmute your mic, it says, does working in the art field affect your personal work? Is it positive or negative? Can you kind of talk about what is personal work? Aisha
Okay.
Al-Hamdani.
Okay. So it's very
Wait,
difficult.
what is wait, just to define what personal work means?
Um, I've seen Azim and Tashkil, to be honest, and I'm always fascinated about to see artists in the field because being an artist myself, I always try to avoid study. I used to avoid it in terms of like bachelor degree and in my professional life, and seeing the amazing work I just have seen that side of you, and I'm proud of you, and I wonder if being in the art field professionally as a full-time job is a good idea. Is
Okay.
it affecting you in a positive or a negative way?
All right. So I still don't know how to if I can define it as positive or negative. It's a bit of a struggle, to be quite honest. Besides the fatigue of like really being exhausted at the end of the day and not finding time to do studio work. But I also acknowledge that that's a reality of having any 9 to 5 job, really. So I can't really say that that has something to do with working in an art specific job, but the fatigue also of looking at too much art and dealing with too much art, it gets overwhelming sometimes. And so I mean, this is where it comes to doing, and this might sound a little bad, but I promise you it's not a bad thing. Like mindless work sometimes. So when I'm making soap, I've done it so many times that I don't necessarily think too much about it while I'm making it. But in the practice, every time I'm making, I have to make some considerations. And if I'm, like I was talking about, time is a factor when I'm making an illustration or drawing. Materials are a factor when I'm doing other things. So without realizing, I'm already thinking about using what resources, what ingredients, if I have someone to help me or not, if I don't have the tools I need. So in order to make a tool, I'm already engaging in a kind of thinking that does affect my personal studio practice. So but it helps that I treat it as mindless work rather than some grand project, me in my studio for hours without sleep in a romantic artistic frenzy. um, at the on the other part is that I do have to make time. So like I sometimes have to force myself, no, you're going to sit down, you're going to do this thing. And it's not easy. um, it's not easy, especially when you're like when I also get concerned that I'm being influenced by all the things that I have to deal with and hear in the day from other artists. Not that they're negative or positive or anything like that, but sometimes I worry that, have I been influenced without being conscious of this influence? And how's it affecting my work? And to be quite honest, it's all still very new to me. I haven't had a 9 to 5 job in a very, very long time. At least not since I've begun, like had my own personal practice that's not illustration based. So it's something I'm still figuring out, but I do acknowledge that I've gotten a lot of great things out of having a job. So access to facilities, a great community that is outside of my original group, which is also really nice because one can get comfortable with their community. And it's nice to meet new people. And of course, an opportunity to be involved in large events in the industry. So that's a really important thing. Whether I want to participate in them as an artist or not, I still have access to what's happening at an international level. So I think those are really helpful things.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think it did. And also, I think you touched upon a really good point. Is like to be aware of your influences that are around you. I think it's really hard, or something that I myself really don't speak about a lot as an artist. You don't really know how much information you're constantly getting. And when you are surrounding yourself with other artists as well, it becomes it is a positive thing. I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but it could be too much at some time, at some point. But yeah, another question Shemma is asking, she's fascinated by the way your work seems to converse with or challenge conceptions of value. In your art making philosophy of sharing, do you quantify or synthesize value?
Okay, so I think about value a lot. And I'm usually like shocked at how in like normal conversations we use the word value when we mean money. And that like it's heartbreaking. um I think in my work, so that I always want to be giving away things. I don't want people to, the idea that the person who has most access to my work can do so because they have more money is so repulsive to me. Not because I think money is evil. No, money is a great tool. It helps us do so many things. But that's not how I want to think about who has access to my work. And so when I'm thinking of making, I have to consider what I can afford to do and how I can stretch that out. And honestly, that's something one can only learn from like mothers. And I feel like in my work, I'm trying to be like my mom. She had 5 kids, and somehow we always felt like we had enough. So I have no idea how she did it, but it's something that I really, really like try to figure out. And every time I do something new, I have to figure it out all over again. And it's difficult and frustrating, but it's something I definitely want to be spending my time on. And that's what I find value in. And that's how I'm going to spend my time when I get that, when I have the time to do it, when I'm not working in order to sustain myself. That's the kind of effort I want to put out into the world. And I'm not saying it's flawless every single time. Where yes, I've cracked the code. I can make infinite amounts of soap or pickles. Not at all. I sometimes have to come to terms with my limitations, and that's also something that's really important for me to realize as a human being. Because if anyone's watched Parasite, there was this like line that they said that really got to me, where someone was like, "Of course she can be nice, she can afford it," and I was like, "Oh my god, is that me?" It was like this really big question, like, was I making things to share because I could afford it? And it terrified me. And but I also realized that my impulse is to share, and sometimes I have very little to share, and somehow I'll try to make something of it. And it also means that I have to come to terms with a lot of realities. And I'd rather do that through this way than something else. And that kind of value to me is really important. Whereas I don't so much think about how much money am I making from a project. I don't think of how much money someone needs to pay to get a bar of soap, and I'm actually really against that. Is everything fine? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
So that I think also I try to figure out where the value lies every single time I work on something, and it also means negotiating, right? So a more traditional gallery approach to exhibiting work and selling work is not necessarily a model that I would like to participate in regularly, if at all, if I can help it. And so figuring out the other systems of how I can still do what I want to do and survive. Um, I know it sounds like I really don't have any answers, but this is where I want to place my labor, and I think that there is an abundance of alternatives that if we invest more of ourselves in, we can figure more options out. I hope that answered the question. I might have spoken too much.
Um, Next question is from Nasser. He says he loves the story of Al-Adlisi and how you ended up with the Crisco. How do you get stories like this across when showing work, whether in sculptural or published form, when you aren't present?
Text is a really important part of my work. I write a lot for myself in my own studio practice. It helps me organize things. Sometimes the organizing is, I think, worthy of sharing. Like, I'm like, yes, this makes sense. Um, and so I write a lot in my installations. So in my thesis, there was text on the wall. Sometimes the text comes in the form of invitation, and sometimes it's information. And then the information can also find other iterations. So I don't work necessarily to exhibit, I work to share. So sometimes what is shared is not necessarily a bar of soap, but a book or a zine or some other thing, right? So in that, it becomes easier to share that kind of information. I can structure it the way I want to. And kind of create a format that allows for visuals or non-chronological readings. So like the last time I installed the soap project was in Tashkil, and then there was this timeline of the history of soap making and the map, and it kind of appeared on the wall in a way that made you move across the wall and back to your starting point, and then led you to the wrappers that you could take to take a piece of soap with you. And so that was one way. And it always depends on the limitations of the point of sharing. So if that's an exhibition, it allows for some things. If I'm contributing to something online, it can be a zine or a book. If it's a publication, that allows for other things as well. So figuring out what the limitations are really informs how much I can share and in what format it is shared in terms of the finding history, it's a matter of, I mean, honestly, the thesis work for the soap took so long. I was reading constantly and worried that I wasn't doing enough work, and then realizing that making connections is a lot of work as well. And that's where a lot of the writing that I had made to make sense of the thing myself was shared in various ways before I wrote my thesis. So by the time it came to writing a thesis, I actually had done a lot of work.
Thanks, Azim.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna probably maybe do two more questions and then wrap up. The next question is from Nebla. As a fellow placeless, displaced, misplaced, multi-placed person, that's really wordy, I deeply appreciate the way in which you practice transcends the natural impulse one might have to first preserve and then hoard. How has your communal, generous, and anti-hoarding stance allowed you to process the feelings surrounding identity and your concept of like home? That's a really long question. I mean, it's also in the chat if you want to read it yourself.
Yeah, I just clicked it open. It's tough, right? So my attachment to the soap comes from my father using the soap. And his attachment to it comes from the fact that he is Palestinian, and this has an association with a time and place. And I think there is an impulse, definitely, and we are raised in a way to kind of be proud about this place that I've never really been to. Not that I have, I mean, I find that calling myself Palestinian is inherently problematic also because I have besides my grandparents having lived there once upon a time, my connection to it is like so removed, not voluntarily, of course, but it becomes difficult to kind of carry that weight. And I felt like I had withheld my Palestinianness from a lot of the critiques in grad school because I thought that that would politicize the work in a way that I didn't know how to deal with. And I felt like it was unfair also because like there's no way that when I say that I'm Palestinian that it comes off as the same way that a Palestinian person living in Palestine, like the meaning that that carries. And so I felt for the long time that I was worried so much about this Palestinianness, and then realizing that when I was investigating hospitality, that the gesture, the action, the details of it might be culturally specific, but I could find a different way to communicate that, and that was what was important to me. So I could be using soap in one context, pickles in another, coffee in another, and if I'm very sure of what it is that's my priority in the work that I'm making, the detail could change and kind of liberate me in some sense from any misculturing. But in terms of figuring out my own identity through that, I cannot say that this has kind of enriched my own sense of identity. I think that I pick materials and ingredients that not that I know well, but things that I have responded to and responded to in the world and want to learn more about. So if anything, it identifies what I wish to become part of my identity as an individual, but not so much. It's very difficult for me to think of myself as belonging to someone else's domain. It's something I'm still trying to figure out, but it's not something I can put words to right now. On the other hand, thinking of home, the hospitality project really broadened up my definition of home and allowed me to see things that I wasn't able to before. So I kept thinking of hospitality, particularly in a Middle Eastern sense of like you are a domain and you have people come into the domain and the opportunity of making them part of the domain as this exchange of resources. And I think that was kind of what I realized, that I was trying to make work that could be light, because carrying work with me everywhere made no sense, because it was really difficult to carry that burden of a home, and rather thinking of home as a set of parameters, ideas, abilities that can allow for different kinds of interactions. And I kind of realized that home is this, I don't know, it's not a geographic or physical thing, but rather that I don't know, it's somewhere between a sense of community and interaction, and a place, a position. And I think that is far more descriptive of how I think of a home than anything else. I still find that in a lot of my investigation in hospitality, I mimic a lot of my family's behavior. And what says, like, nothing said more home to me than being able to witness that. Because even if I tried to make a house look the same as their house, or live in the country, I could still not feel a lot of those things if I weren't hosting dinner parties or giving away soap. I hope, yeah. I mean, it's a very tricky question. I really hope that made sense.
Yeah, it's a really loaded question as well. Oh, Nebla, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Nebla, you can unmute. Okay. And we're going to take one more question. It's from Faisal. And then there's a follow-up to that. Yeah, so he says, do you see your work coming out of the gallery/art world context in the future to be perhaps even more accessible? And then Leon, adding to his question, is saying, if not those spaces which we are so used to relying on in the UAE, what kind of alternative spaces or platforms do you imagine could house your work?
It's tricky because the word house was used. So I'm a firm believer that if I want to
like, ruin my question. Just focus on my question.
So I think that when I'm thinking about like alternative spaces, it also comes with this thing about a lot of art practices that like kind of upsets me a little bit. I don't want there to ever be a focus on my labor as an artist. Or at least if that's not at the forefront of what I'm talking about. Yes, sometimes like I have to think about how to split resources, but I'm not so much interested in people thinking about me splitting those resources and then giving me credit for sharing resources. And so I think that a lot of these things, once they're labeled as art, there's this expectation that the artist gets attention. And I'm still navigating that. And so thinking of a space as a formal kind of place to share an art practice, I can't kind of think of an ideal place. However, sharing happens everywhere. And I gave away just as many bars of soap in my studio that I did in the gallery. I gave away just as many bars of soap because of these bags that I carry. I actually almost always have soap in my bag and always find an opportunity to give to someone. And that so in my last year in grad school, I had made over 2,000 bars of soap, and only 500 to 600 were at the exhibition. And so the others were also all gone by the time I left Richmond. And so there were all these other things that were happening. Yes, they don't accommodate a very large group of people, but in accommodating, like if I'm going to go back to that comic book, there are sacrifices to be made when I need to accommodate a larger group. And so the idea that I'm giving this bar of soap to someone at an individual level, or with it like an intentional giving away, it does something very different than putting it in a gallery space. I'm not prioritizing one over the other, but they're very different kinds of engagement, and every opportunity to find something out, more about how I give away something is really, really a learning opportunity. I don't think there'll ever be one format for it. That being said, I don't want it to be an impersonal thing where people can order or take in bulk. There's this thing that happened when I was giving away bars of soap. People would come back to me and tell me that they thought of me in the shower. And it's like this really, like, especially, like I grew up here, and as open as I'd like to think of myself, there are still some things that I hear that sound very scandalous. And so, like, oh my God, like, and then realizing that that's actually like this really private space. And I gave this person a bar of soap, and now they thought of me in this like really quiet personal space. And they thought of how nice this bar, or like they would say like, oh, I thought it was a great bar of soap. And it's really sweet. And I don't know that, I mean, so like the bathroom becomes a place where this could happen. And I'd never even think of that. But I guess it means that a lot of spaces can be, when kind of approached. So if there's a limitation to a place, like I was saying, like time is a limitation, space is a limitation, resources are limits. If I'm responding to a space, it could be any space, and I'll still find a way in which I could share effectively in that. So there is no particular space that is of more interest to me than another. However, what I do hope that I can do in a space is to kind of create that moment that happened in someone's bathroom. Actually, the first person who told me that was a professor, and then like it took her a few seconds, it took me, and like I was just like shocked, and then she realized like, oh my God, no. And then it was like, I thought that was like one of the best experiences in grad school, because it revealed so many things to me. So yeah, I can't think of an ideal space. That being said, I do want to answer Lan's question, because and in terms of thinking of spaces which we're so used to relying on in the UAE, what kind of alternative spaces platforms do I imagine could house my work? I don't think of my work as having to be housed. I think of it as having to be consumed. The idea that a bar of soap is sitting somewhere rotting makes me sad, because it's like a resource that someone else could have been using. And so, and if it's like a zine, if the zine wasn't read and contributed to someone's thinking, it's very difficult. So I mean, once again, it sounds bad, but I promise I don't mean it in a negative way. Like, I don't care where the zine rests or is housed. I care that someone's read it. And that could be through phones, through WhatsApp, like through images taken through a phone via WhatsApp, or through a downloadable link, or shared physically by someone giving the copy to someone else. And that's far more important to me. Fixed places, objects, and spaces are difficult to carry around. And as someone who moves a lot and wants to be lighter, it's very it's very difficult for me to think of these things concretely as being part of the work, any like fixed thing. And also, I don't want people to just enjoy the benefits of good soap. I want them to think of how they can also share something afterwards, or how they can share information. So the effect of what it is that I share is far more important, that that's maybe housed in their mind or their soul or their spirit. It sounds very romantic, but like really that's kind of what I hope for. That being said, I haven't really exhibited the soap in that many galleries. Like it was like two times. It's existed in other formats. It's mostly in bathrooms, actually. When I went back to visit the campus of my the grad program I was in, I actually found that all the bathrooms in the building where my studio was had bars of my soap. I didn't even know that I hadn't put them there. I hadn't put them there in a year, and yet someone had taken a lot of my soap and was kind of putting them in all the bathrooms to mimic what I had been doing a year before, and that felt very good. I hope that answered.
I think it did. I think those are all the questions we have. We were a bit over time, but that's fine. So I just wanted to say thank you again for being my first guest on this series.
Thank you
And
so much for having me. This was really great. And thank you everyone for listening. This
yeah, thank you
really
all
great
for
interview.
your time and your support. And I hope to see you guys in the following sessions. Follow me on Instagram so you can stay updated with announcements on who's going to be joining next week. And since this is my first time doing something like this, I appreciate all feedback and comments if you want to message me and just have a little chat. But yeah, thank you everyone. All right, we're going to end it now. Hope you all have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.